Hello, college volleyball fans. Welcome to a special episode of College Football Throwdown. This is episode 196. I'm your co-host, Alex Schmitz, and today I'm joined, as always, by my dad, Peter Schmitz.
Wow, 196. We're getting close to the infamous 200.
That's right. And for those who may be listening to this podcast for the first time, we are a father-son duo that's usually here to talk about Nebraska football and everything going on in the general world of college football. But today is going to be a bit of a special episode. This is the first time I believe we've ever done this, where we've talked about Nebraska women's volleyball quite a bit on the podcast over the years in segments, but we've never dedicated a full podcast to it. However, this is going to be the first of its kind, and it's for a special occasion, of course, because about a month ago, John Cook, the legendary coach at Nebraska for volleyball, announced his retirement. So we wanted to do a proper episode to tribute John Cook's amazing legacy of 25 years at the University of Nebraska, and also talk about the program's future and where we're going. So it'll be a fun one.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, so fair warning to any, college football only fans or more nationally focused fans. This is going to be a Husker specific talk, but we're going to get into some interesting things about, the overall history of women's volleyball, how NIL and the portal have affected what's come, in the past few years and all that sort of stuff as well.
That's right. There's so much to talk about, and we'll see how much we get through.
That's right. You might have to hold yourself back, Dad.
I know.
All right. Well, we are going to stick with our tradition and open up a cold beverage here. I have myself one of these Golden Road Brewing Mango Cart, and this time I did not crack it early.
Oh, good. Well, I'm drinking the basic fine Pilsner that is Miller Lite. So I'm going a little light tonight. Cheers, son.
Cheers.
Okay. Just a little reference. So it's still quite warm. This is a day, usually our temperature drops pretty rapidly after sunset here in the Valley of the Sun near Phoenix, where I'm located, but it's still nice and comfy warm outside.
That's very true. All righty. So we're going to go ahead and kick this off, as we said, with the proper tribute to John Cook. We talked about this a bit on the previous football podcast, but he was our head coach at Nebraska for 25 years. And in that time, he brought 4 national championships to Nebraska. He brought us to 8 tournament finals, 12 Final Fours, and 14 conference titles. Also included in that list is 22 times out of the 25 years, 22 times he finished in the top 10 overall rankings. Is in the top 5 winningest coaches of all time in women's volleyball.
Wow. And, we need to go back and state a couple of those things again. First of all, let's talk about the number of times that he made the Final Four. Those 2 stats you said, the number of times he was in the finals.
Which was 8.
8. Okay, we won 4 of those. So he was 50%, which when you're competing at that level, that's, if you look at Super Bowl opportunities with most Super Bowl teams and things like that, or the premier football programs over the years who've played in lots of national championships, most of them, if anybody's well over 50% in terms of the win category when you're in that level, that's exceptional, right? Like 50% it's a crapshoot when you get to that point. And so that's impressive in itself, but more impressive then is that next number, which is the number of Final Fours, right?
Right, which was 12.
Well, that's 12 semifinals. Was that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, 12 out of 25. So basically, half of the years that he was coach at Nebraska, half the time he made the Final Four.
Yes. And one thing I actually didn't know before doing this research was, in terms of those 4 national championships, they came in the year 2000, 2006, 2015, and 2017. And 2000 was his first year as a coach. And not only did we win the national championship, we also went undefeated, which only happened a small number of times. So for that to be his very first year as the head coach and to have basically a perfect season. Talk about high expectations going forward.
Oh yeah. Well, and a little bit of irony on that, of course, is that the team he played in that final was his former team. He had left the year before from Wisconsin to become the associate head coach at Nebraska. So he was associate head coach in 1999 at Nebraska. So Terry Pettit offered him the job, but said, "Hey, I want to coach for this '99 season with you as my associate, and then you'll get the job in 2020. That way, we can transition together, and you can learn the ropes, and we'll work through this thing together, right?" Which was quite a unique transitional approach that we used with that coaching transition. So many actually thought that's the way it would happen this time when John retired, but it didn't work out that way. But still amazing that, a lot of the players that he recruited to Wisconsin, and he had built that program from not all that great to a consistent winner. And then it culminated in them making it to the national championship game against John and the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and John came out on top in his first year.
Right. And he was at Wisconsin for 7 years before he came to Nebraska. So that's basically 32 years of coaching in total. And in terms of his overall win rate, he won 883 games and lost 176 for a total win rate of about 83%. And of those 883 wins, 722 came at Nebraska. So wow. He's had quite the run.
Yes. I mean, there's no questioning that John was an exceptional coach. And I don't know if, from a history standpoint, it's probably important to mention that this thing of Nebraska volleyball didn't start with John. It was really built in the 70s and through the 80s and early 90s by his predecessor, Terry Pettit. Now, Terry's the guy that came into Nebraska. He was the second head coach in Nebraska. There was the first coach, I don't remember her name, but she was coached for a few years, and then they asked Terry Pettit to take the job. And so Terry did, and he understood that he needed to build from the ground up. He needed to build the interest in the sport from the state, and he did all kinds of unique things. He was incredible at reaching out to high school coaches and providing clinics and just building a great coaching, resume for all of these assistants throughout the state, and building and growing the state of volleyball in Nebraska. The high school volleyball in Nebraska just soared during those years because Terry helped all these coaches just get better. And so their coaching then helped lead to better talent. And so we had, and even to this day, Nebraska continues to produce a number of NCAA Division I volleyball athletes at a rate that's far higher than their population as a state should justify, right? It's out of whack with our population, how we get that many premier volleyball players. And it's a combination of things. And some people could point to the fact that, we've got a lot of German and Scandinavian heritage in the state of Nebraska, and those tend to be tall women. So there's that. But more significantly, I think, was the coaching acumen of the coaching staffs throughout the state of Nebraska, and the continued commitment from Terry Pettit over a period of 20 years to build this thing, right? And then John came in and fully understood it, because John had been an assistant under Terry Pettit. Russ Rose, who we'll probably talk about a little later in terms of legacy, who's regarded probably as the greatest volleyball coach of all time, certainly from the standpoint of national championships and total wins and all that sort of stuff. Russ was also an assistant under Terry Pettit. So pretty remarkable lineage there, right? That ties to Nebraska, and John was a part of that. So just an amazing run, and his ability to reinvent himself. I'm going to shift gears here to John Cook now, and we just went over his history, but let's talk a little bit about his legacy, Alex. Did anything come up that kind of fits that from your standpoint?
Well, I was actually just doing a little counting over here on my end because I got a picture here of all the various seasons. So of that, the 25 years at Nebraska, right? In terms of our overall record, how many times in those 25 years do you think he had five or more than five losses?
Hmm. Well, there were a few years there, especially in the the early 2010s. So I'm going to say three times, maybe.
No, you're you're overestimating him a bit. It was seven. So there were seven times he had five or more losses. But
Five or more. Okay.
right,
Okay. I was thinking 10 for some reason. I apologize.
okay, no, yeah. But phrased another way, right? So that means out of 25 years, 18 of those years he had five losses or less, right? And oftentimes under
Right.
three losses. You
And
know,
and keep in mind that a typical volleyball season it is some years they would play as many as 40 games, but in more recent years it's been 30 to 34, 35 games is what a team would play if they make it all the way to the championship. So, you know, to lose 5 out of 30 games, that's saying something, right? 5 or less.
right. Out of 35, yeah. And obviously, like some of the videos I watched talked about, the extensive coaching tree he's built up and the number of former players who came back to work with him on the staff, right? And how he thought that that was an important sign that, the girls enjoyed their time there and enjoyed the striving for excellence that he enforced in them and decided to come back later to work under him professionally. Danny Busboom Kelly, who we'll talk about later, the new head coach, is one of those people on that list.
Right. And that is a huge list. Some of the best coaches in the country, in fact, are on that list. And there's if we want to get a little deeper into that, not one of the things that John was known for doing, there were plenty of people who didn't like his demeanor. John was not a guy who wanted to be a volleyball coach, right? He was born and raised in San Diego. He wanted to be a football coach. He wanted to be a teacher and a football coach. And when he was early in his career as a teacher, the athletic director at the school that he was coaching at or that he was teaching at asked him to be the girls' volleyball coach because they didn't have anybody else to do it. And he agreed to do it basically because he was told that was the option. And he was an assistant football coach, but his goal was to be, to stay on the football side. But he embraced the volleyball, and within a few years, their volleyball program became successful. And so he kind of stayed with it. And that's what kind of eventually led him to this path. But as a result, the origins of his coaching style and his intensity and some of those aspects of his overall coaching philosophy were really embedded in his time as a football coach.
Right. Well, and the video I watched specifically, I guess there were two I watched, but in one of them, he mentioned how he was obviously more hardcore when he was younger,
Right.
in terms of his demeanor to the girls, generally more intense. He wasn't there to be your friend, he was there to be your coach, that kind of thing. But he talked about how he kind of ran into a wall in like 2008, 2009 type time frame, and like was really dealing with a lot of stress and stuff and some physical problems. And he talked to Coach Osborne about it, and Osborne talked to him about his own experiences with that and the heart attack he suffered while being the head coach of Nebraska. And so he started, John Cook rather, started to change some things up, right? Try to be more healthy, try to calm down, and in the later years, he definitely did calm down and became more relaxed with his players than he was earlier on in his career.
Right. Right. And, that was huge for him, right? Like, he was a guy that was, he describes himself regularly as a man who viewed himself as a lifelong learner. Right. He was always inquisitive, always wanting to try different things. In fact, going back to his relationship with Tom Osborne, which is obviously very, very important to him. And he views Tom as a mentor. But Tom became a pilot as one of the things that Tom did to help, give him some external interests beyond football. And so then Tom recommended that John try becoming a pilot. So John did. And so he had a period of time when he was heavy into planes. And that was his outside interest that he drew from and he read books on and all that sort of stuff. And prior to that, actually, even before the pilot thing, John got heavy into golf and was all about, trying to optimize his golf game and trying to then leverage those experiences into making himself a better coach. It's tough to play the game of golf. There's so many details to a swing and different strategies and things of that nature. And that helped him become a better coach. The sophistication of an aircraft and becoming certified and all that, and how important those decisions were. Obviously, if you're flying a plane, that was hugely important to him. And then he transitioned to some other interests. So he's had 3 or 4 of these things. The last one, of course, that is well publicized in this social media era was his interest in horses and specifically roping cows, right? And he tried to do that as much to keep his own sanity and interest going, right? But also in an effort to seek wisdom and new ways to communicate to his athletes, and also to translate, what makes a good roper, and how does that relate to volleyball.
Right.
So he was always a guy that was learning, trying to understand different things, and then sharing that learning with not only his team but his former players, who many of whom had become coaches. So there's just a lot of legacy there with
Right.
coaches who've done very, very well, including the current national championship winning coach at Kentucky, and of course Danny Busboom Kelly, who's gone to 3 Final Fours in 8-year time frame. Even Sheffield at Wisconsin has acknowledged and wanted to convey his respect for John and how John helped him when he was a younger coach, and John was very forthright in giving him lots of advice and helping guide him, and they were on phone calls regularly together. The Kansas coach who just recently retired, Ray Bouchard, also a lifelong coaching friend of Coach Cook, and they shared information, and he was very influential in Kansas's rise to success. They had become last year's co-champions of the Big 12, and they've had a consistent run of excellence, over Ray's career as well. So just a tremendous influence on the game from a game standpoint, from a coaching and a strategy standpoint, right?
Right.
But then there's a whole nother thing too. But go ahead, Alex, you had something?
Yeah, well, also in that video, one of the interesting elements was he talked about how there hadn't been like a sellout of for the women's volleyball team, when he started, and how he wanted to have that be happening consistently, like it was for Nebraska's football team. And he discussed in this video, how he took the girls on a trip to China early on in his time, and how that was something that never happened before for the women's volleyball at any, college level school. And how he went to the, boosters to get some money to get that to happen. And they gave it to him and they made it happen. But he thought that I want to make women's volleyball a revenue generating sport, so I don't have to come to these guys to ask for favors like this. And obviously over time he did get to that point where now Bob Devaney does always sell out, and Nebraska's women's volleyball team is a revenue generating sport. And the obvious sellout of Memorial Stadium being kind of the culmination of that aspect of John Cook's career. It's very impressive to see, for sure.
Right. And what do you want to call it? The trips abroad. That has become a thing. So the NCAA has a rule that you can only do that once every 4 years. So that allows for basically every group of athletes. This is, of course, prior to portals and stuff. But the concept was, you could then, promote to your student athletes that, hey, over the course of your career, if you stay until graduation 4 years here at Nebraska, you're going to get an international trip. That was something that some other sports, particularly basketball, had kind of started. But then John Cook raised his hand and said, hey, I want to do that for volleyball. and no one else had done it. And of course, volleyball was not a revenue sport anywhere in the country. So, most athletic workers are going to say, no, I don't think that's going to happen. But John did the legwork. He pounded the path, the pavement, to get funding, particularly from the beef club at Nebraska, which was obviously a huge supporter of the football program, and they agreed to pay the bill. But it also caused him to be motivated to say, I need to find a way that I can build this thing into a revenue generator that makes enough revenue that we can do these kinds of trips and not have to go out and ask for the money, right? And he was the first one to really think big like that, and that became one of his monikers, is dream big, right? And that came well before the volleyball day in Nebraska event that, of course, everybody references because of that. He also did some other really creative things that still is happening today. Currently, our Nebraska team is in the middle of their beach season. Nebraska is one of the only schools. Texas did it for a couple of years, but then transitioned to real beach athletes. I think they only have one player from the interior indoor court team that's playing on the beach team. But Nebraska created now nearly a decade ago a beach volleyball program that was specifically designed as an experiment by John to help build their skill sets and to give them an opportunity to work on some things, because in the beach game there's only two players on each side, and so your middle blockers and your setter has to become an attacker. Your middle blockers have to learn to dig and have to learn to serve, and so it's a much more broadening thing. You have to be a well-rounded volleyball player to be a good beach player, right? And so he decided that, what, I'm gonna start having my team become the beach team. So all the indoor players become the beach players in the winter, and that allows them to continue to compete and develop their skills and work on their game. And that was unique at the time. And without that beach element in the past, other teams they couldn't actually get together and work with coaches, right? During their off season, you had in season and out of season, and out of season there were specific rules about limiting time and coaching and whether or not they could be with their athletes. Because this was a beach program that allowed them to have that interaction legally, right, within the rules. So it was a real advantage. And I think John still believes in it, because it allows them to, get out of Nebraska in the middle of January when it's at its worst, and go play in Hawaii and play in California and play down in Florida. So that's what they do. They end up in these tournaments. Now, honestly speaking, they never have created this beach program with the eye towards competing for championships, right? We don't even have beach volleyball as an official, competed in sport. It's still, I don't know what they call it, but it's not a sport that competes for a Big Ten championship. There's not enough schools that have beach programs at this time, right? Because we're from the North mostly, right?
Right.
Now we've got UCLA and USC and some of those West Coast schools that did have beach programs. So maybe down the road we might actually open it up and start having one. But for now, we don't. And so that's kind of interesting, because he was, again, creative, leading the way, doing something different. And it really has. I mean, so many. Number one, it's a phenomenal recruiting pitch. Hey, come to Nebraska. And not only do you get to play in front of a sold out crowd every week, not only are you going to, have the best resources and the most supportive fans and all these other things, but also, unlike anybody else, you're going to go to Hawaii every year as part of the beach team. You're going to go to Florida for a week. You're going to go to California for a week. So 3 weeks or more of that winter time gap, you're going to be in these warm weather climates enjoying things. It allowed him to build team chemistry. It allowed him to, he has a tradition of taking each girl or maybe two players out with him for private dinner with two players at a time. So to build relationships. I mean, he did all of these things that no one else was doing. So it was just a guy that was always looking ahead, always trying to do something bigger and better. And And some of the things that allowed him to do that was our amazing financial success, because we were selling out that arena, because we had a rabid fan base that was contributing money, and the merchandise sales and things of that nature, explosively successful at Nebraska for volleyball. And now, I don't know, just yesterday was National Women in Sports Day, I think it was called. And Adidas did a national ad buy where they did this new ad that ran in all the social medias and on TV and everything. And Nebraska's volleyball team was the only collegiate volleyball team included in their little video montage. So, I mean, they have put themselves to where this last season probably is the pinnacle of that group of athletes, that included Lexi Rodriguez and let's see, Lindsay Krause, Kennedy Orr. Merritt was a senior. Yeah, that group they were rock stars. Literally everywhere they went, sellouts. It didn't matter whether the team they were playing was any good or was maybe in the bottom half of the Big Ten. When Nebraska showed up, boom, the place would be sold out. And not only would it be, the students showing up, but it would be fans who are just aware of Nebraska volleyball, primarily because of Volleyball Day in Nebraska. Little girls coming and wanting to get autographs from these girls. They are rock stars in the country because of that. And again, that has helped catapult this sport to where now it's getting visibility on ABC and CBS and NBC, as well as ESPN, things that virtually did not happen before, right? So it's changed the dynamic.
Right. Well, and I think that leads us into a quick conversation about John's overall influence on women's collegiate volleyball as a whole over these 25 years. And one of the aspects which I think ties in well with that beach volleyball program you're just talking about and how he wants his players to have versatility is John's focus on defense, right? The old adage is obviously defense wins championships, and John's a firm believer in that. And we saw it, over and over again in a lot of the games we've watched these past few years, right? How we dig things that nobody else would dig and just keep sets alive, right? And even though we may have some critiques on our attacking power, right, and how maybe we don't have the same height advantages that certain other teams do, or don't hit it as hard at times and things like that, but that impenetrable defense has proven to be a valuable strategy that has carried John throughout this 25-year period.
Absolutely. And and there's more. He was super influential. He was on the rules committee, right? And so he was heavily influential in getting some rule changes that have enhanced the game. He was not afraid to speak out, about things that he thought needed to happen. One thing he pushed for that he never got, right, was he would have loved to have seen the sport of volleyball move to a spring sport. He felt like it would have gotten more visibility from a television standpoint in the spring, when you're not competing head to head for TV cameras, so to speak, with football, right? And if you went into a springtime sport, that would be at the end of basketball, right? And men's and women's basketball would be doing their March Madness, but then that would be the beginning of the season for women's volleyball. And when his vision was, then we'd be competing with men's baseball and track and field and things like that for the television spots, right? And he always felt like we could have done way better as a sport, or women's volleyball could have done way better as a sport, if they had chosen that. Now, that never took off. And frankly, now with all the other things that have transpired, that's probably was a blessing in disguise for the sport, because they finally got around to recognizing the amazing television aspects of the sport of volleyball. Volleyball is unique in a number of ways as a sport, and I think he was super influential in that. And obviously, a huge impact was Nebraska moving to the Big Ten. Penn State was the dominant program in the Big Ten. It was kind of Big Ten and the other 10. It was one big one and 10 other teams that weren't so great. And then and Nebraska and Texas, of course, were the dominant teams in the Big 12. And then Nebraska moved to the Big Ten in 2011, and that changed the dynamic of volleyball. And it raised the challenge to every Big Ten school that, hey, if you want women's volleyball to matter at your school, you're going to have to step up your commitment, your investment, your promotion, all that stuff, or you're going to get left behind, because Nebraska's coming in and they're selling out arenas and they're going to run roughshod on us if we don't step up. And to their credit, the Big Ten schools did. Right, they had the money and they stepped it up, and that's why we now have this Big Ten conference that tends to be one of the best conferences year in and year out in volleyball. And now, just in these last 2 or 3 years, the SEC, with the move of Texas from the Big 12 into the SEC, now has, I think, sprung a huge surge into the SEC. And the SEC, which I think Kentucky has won like 7 or 8 years in a row. Kentucky's and been champion or co-champions of the SEC. I mean, the SEC was basically Florida for a long time, and then it became Kentucky and Florida. And now there's probably a half a dozen teams in the SEC that are national title contenders going into this next season, 2025. So the SEC has arrived. And obviously the ACC has been around for a few years, thanks to Danny Busboom Kelly and Dan Fisher at Pitt. The ACC has been very prominent with those two, but they're kind of still a top-heavy conference. And the Big Ten is deep and talented across the board. It'll be interesting to see what 2025 brings from a conference strength standpoint, because I really think the Big Ten's going to be a little down. A lot of teams lost talent to graduation. The COVID years are over, and the SEC actually is going to rise in this coming season, I predict.
Yeah. Now, obviously, we need to talk about his successor, who is Danny Busboom Kelly. But before that, just a final kind of note on John. Where would you put him amongst the best women's volleyball coaches of all time? I did a bit of research before this. There aren't like a ton of articles like ranking these coaches or whatever,
No.
but everybody seems to agree that Russ Rose, who was at Penn State for 42 years and won 7 national championships, he's kind of considered to be the top by pretty much everybody. But then now that John's retired, right now we can kind of look at his career in totality. And he's definitely in the top 10 for sure, maybe even the top 5 for a lot of people.
I would say top 5. He's like third on the list, maybe in terms of number of national titles won, which is obviously one of the key measuring sticks whenever you talk about coaching, hierarchy. But then you also have to look at the consistency of excellence, right? And then what did you do to grow the sport? What does your coaching tree look like, right? Were you supportive of bringing in young assistants who then you nurtured and then you encouraged and let them go, right? So that they could go and be success outside of your own. See, John, I think, was better than Russ Rose at that, right? The coaching tree aspect of it, his impact on the sport of volleyball beyond winning, John is the guy, right? But in terms of being a coach and having success inside the lines of the court, then I would say he's probably, in my mind, he's third behind Russ Rose, and then John Dunning from Stanford, and then John. That's where I would put him.
Right. Well, I know you also talked about Mick Haley from USC is definitely up there as well.
And Mick gets a lot of credit because he's either the only one or he's one of 2 guys that have won national championships at multiple schools. Mick won a national championship at Texas, and he also won national championships at USC. So, that's saying something when you are able to, your coaching style obviously translated enough that you were able to bring 2 different institutions to that level of success. Even now, even though there's been a new coach that won it this year, the number of schools that have won national championships is still quite small. I think it's like 11 or 12 schools out of whatever. There's probably, I don't know, 200 and some Division One volleyball programs across the country, and only like 12 or 13 of them have actually won a national title. So it's a pretty small fraternity of schools that have risen to that level. So to say that you were the guy that brought them to a national championship at two different schools, that's saying something. And this is a sport that obviously was dominated in the first 20 years by the West Coast, because of course volleyball was a West Coast sport.
Right.
It was something they played year round out there, and they played it on the beach, obviously, as well. And even before the beach became an NCAA sport, the indoor was already an NCAA sport. So those talented players, tended to be concentrated in the West Coast. That has obviously shifted, and now the Midwest has been the stalwart of it. But now in the last 10 years, the sport has exploded so much with club volleyball and everything like that, that there is now incredible talent across the board. And that's not necessarily a good thing when you think about the future of Nebraska volleyball, in that I don't think we can sustain the dominance that we've had both within our conference and nationally going forward, simply because the depth of talent is far greater than it's ever been.
Right.
And now population's going to matter more, right? The level of coaching and skill development and training that's going on now is way better than it was before. So Nebraska's advantage, thanks to Terry Pettit and the coaching clinics that he did back in the 1980s, that differential, that advantage, it's disappearing. It's getting back to who's got the athletes and where are the athletes located. And so much like the other sports like college football and college basketball and things like that, it's the population centers where athletes tend to be in greater numbers. Right.
Yep.
So it's going to have an impact. But that doesn't mean that we can't continue to be excellent. I just think, and I feel like one of the things I was doing while I've been talking, Alex, is kind of looking at the recent years. I'm going to start back in 2015. Okay. In 2015, we were the national champions. In 2016, we lost in the semifinals to Texas.
Right.
In 2017, we won the national championship again. In 2018, we were runners up to Stanford. So we played in the championship game and lost. Then we lost to Wisconsin in 19 in the regional final. Then in 2020, we lost to Texas in the semifinals. And then remember, that was COVID time. So then there was the year after the COVID year, 21, Wisconsin won the national championship, beating us in the national championship game. And, that was a 5-set, legendary game. The 18 game against Stanford, legendary 5-set game in which, in both of those games, 18 and 21, we were the underdog, the significant underdog. Wisconsin had beaten us both times in 21 quite handily. And then we took them to 5. And frankly, I was there and we should have won. Then in 22, we lost in the regional semifinals. Quite a disappointment. We lost to a talented Oregon squad. And had we won that game, and it was really, really close, 1 or 2 plays, there's a very good chance we would have made it to the finals, because the team that we would have played next, I think, would have been somebody we could beat. So we would have gotten to the finals, but we didn't. And then in 23, we lost in the finals to Texas. And in 24, we lost in the semifinals to Penn State. So think about that. That's 8 of the last 10 years John was in Final Four.
Yeah, it's definitely impressive. I'm looking at a similar sheet here, and you can kind of see how, it feels like he had a very good start, at the beginning of his career, right? We won in 2000, we won in 2006. And then, like you're saying, kind of the late 2000s and early 2010s, that's probably the kind of low ebb of his career, in that, we Didn't make the finals for quite a while during that time, but then in the mid 2010s, he kind of figured it out. He got a great recruiting class, and we had that period of 4 years, like you say, where we went to three titles in a row, or three titles over the course of that 4 years, and won two of them, right?
Right.
And now most recently, obviously it is disappointing, right? Like these past 2 years, specifically 23 and 24, both times we definitely had a shot at winning the national championship. It didn't quite happen, but John's had other victories, like we talked about on the 2024 podcast, how we beat Wisconsin 3 times, right? Which Wisconsin's kind of been his problem matchup in the Big Ten the whole time we've been there. And so for us to have that dominance over them in that year with that particular team was something pretty special.
Absolutely right. And the thing is I think that the fact that we haven't won a national title in those years is an indication both of what's happening nationally in the sport of women's volleyball. The talent is just so much greater. And then that leads to the influence of the COVID, right? If you go back to the COVID years, we lost to a Texas team in 20, and then we lost in the national championship game to Wisconsin in 21. Wisconsin doesn't have that team without COVID. They had like 3 or 4 key players that were in their fifth year of actually playing, not having redshirted,
right,
but actually playing for their fifth year. So all of these years, there has been a level of talent because of that additional year that under normal circumstances of the past, those people would have been out of eligibility and gone. And in any of those scenarios, that might have been the difference that I believe it was the difference that would have led, because we didn't have a lot of those fifth-year players, right? We had some transfers because, again, that was also the time frame of the start of
the transfer portal.
Right. And that sort of stuff. So that becomes a complicated conversation that maybe requires a whole nother podcast, right? That we could integrate with a football discussion. But very similar to football, NIL has had a massive, maybe even more so than football, a massive impact on the sport of volleyball. I mean, it's actually amazing. The volleyball teams up until this year had a scholarship limit of 12 players. Okay, 12 players. And the number of girls that went in the portal this year and in recent years has been over 1,000. And it ends up being somewhere just short of 3 players per team per year that were going into the portal on average.
Right.
So you're literally having a 24% turnover of everybody's roster every year. And the truth is the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer in many respects. So talent has tended to concentrate. Well, we happen to, during that same time frame, have this legendary freshman class that included Rodriguez and Krause and Allie Batenhorst for most of her career, Whitney Lowenstein, who's still, ironically, because of red shirts and other things, and she took a year off because she had a child. She's looking at her 6th year. She still has a year of eligibility at Texas. She transferred to Texas. So, but if you look at all that talent, if they weren't competing against a bunch of 5th-year players, then maybe one of these national championship losses or semifinal losses isn't a loss because those other teams don't have that talent there. Right. So I really think the lack of national championships in his last 4 or 5 years, I would attribute some of that to the unique set of circumstances that existed with COVID extra years and the addition of the portal and the ability for some of the key competitors like Texas and Wisconsin and Penn State to reload their rosters with experienced, talented players, not freshmen, but experienced, talented players because of the portal.
Right. Well, and I will say as just one small counterpoint to that, all those same rules apply to Nebraska too. So we've been able to have, when those players who are younger, 21, got to 24 or whatever over time, right? Now they get their extra year if they want to use it to stay on longer.
Exactly.
And we could have taken advantage of the portal if we wanted to and brought in these fifth year seniors that are really experienced or whatever. But John purposefully chose to not embrace that as much as some other schools, like you say, because he had this great freshman class and he wanted to develop that talent in the old school way, so to speak.
And he did go out and get portal talent, but usually as a backfill for somebody who was leaving, because we did have our share of portal transfers as well. My only point is that when you look at over on the big picture of things and you scrutinize that these last 5 years, there were so many dynamics that were changing very rapidly. And you are correct. We could have done that, but if those options didn't exist, right? If things had not changed during COVID and we hadn't done the portal thing, then in all likelihood, the progression of that very talented class and the talented classes that followed up after it, we would have had a talent superiority that was probably greater than what actually ended up happening, because some of our key competitors were then, just circumstances allowed them to have scholarships available, right? Wisconsin had a massive departure of talent that just was running out of eligibility, but they were able to backfill it with phenomenal talent who wasn't coming in as a freshman, not some high potential player, but somebody who'd already proven it at the Big Ten level or at the SEC or ACC. You know what I mean? There's a difference. And just like we've seen in college football, there's a difference when you're able to go out and get a guy like we did at Nebraska this year, where we got a guy who's started, 30 games at Notre Dame to play guard for us next year. That wasn't available in years past. It really wasn't. And now it is.
Right.
And so teams being able to do that has changed college sports, in a huge way.
And we've talked on past football podcasts when we've mentioned volleyball about how the transfer portal is even more crazy in the world of volleyball than it is for football because of the smaller roster sizes and because of the importance of each individual player. Those back and forths can have even more impact on the long-term, future of your team.
Absolutely.
And as part of that, with the revenue sharing deal that we know is coming down from Congress and that we talked about on last week's episode of the main podcast, I was kind of dwelling on that a little bit more because we were discussing how all the resources get allocated, right? Because obviously schools are going to allocate a lot to football and basketball on the men's side, the big revenue generating sports. And then, how do they allocate money to kind of lesser sports like track and field or bowling or volleyball or things like that, because even if you have a good history of succeeding in that sport, if you don't have the payday, if somebody else can offer more, then the talented players will go that way.
Right. Or certainly might, right? I mean, some might still go to that team because of their history and reputation, but in all likelihood, money's going to talk.
Right. And what I was thinking about was if you're a mid or a lower level college, generally at sports or whatever, and you look at like the amount of money that, a Michigan or Ohio State or whatever is putting into their football or basketball program, right? And you're probably just like, there's no universe where we can outcompete them for money in those major profitable sports, right? So what if I'm a mid-level school or whatever, and I'm like, I'm not even going to try, so I'm going to give very little money to football, if at all. Instead, I'm going to put all that money into these other sports like a volleyball or track and field or swimming or whatever.
Wrestling,
yeah. And basically be able to swing big money in a small pond, right? It's a way less of an investment to have, the market value of a player in this sport versus football or whatever. So that's where I'm going to allocate my resources and try to make a name for myself that way. I thought that would be an interesting strategy.
Oh, absolutely. The challenge then, of course, though, for any athletic department or athletic director would be the cash cow at every Division I institution has got to be football. So you almost cannot afford to go skimpy there. Right. Okay, because if you don't, and it'll become obvious, and all your fan base will recognize that you're not trying, and they'll stop contributing, right? They'll stop attending games, and all of a sudden your biggest revenue producer, football, is going to die slowly on the vine, right? And that might even risk your long-term presence in a major league, right? A major conference. Because if all of a sudden it was obvious as an athletic department that you were giving up on football and reallocating a bunch of these revenue dollars, then if you're in the Big Ten and you chose to do that, how long would it be before the Big Ten conference came a calling and saying, hey, buddy, if you're not even going to try in football, then you're not going to get the revenue share because you're bringing a product that's inferior and you're not even trying, right?
Right.
So I think you have to do it in football. There's just no, and football is typically going to be 75% plus of that total revenue share is likely going to football. That's what I would speculate.
Right.
So if 75% of it is going there, we're really talking about what do you do with that final 25%? And that's where these allocations within the lesser sports, the Olympic sports, if you will, that's where that becomes something that is certainly much more of a decision that athletic departments can make. And that's where NIL is going to become the huge differentiator, right? Everybody in the major conferences is going to get the pretty substantial payday from the revenue share. The difference is going to continue to be NIL revenue. The example I would use is SMU. SMU is one of the few teams that beat us this year in volleyball. They also made the college football playoff. 3 years ago, SMU wasn't even in a Power 5 conference, right? They just joined the Big 12.
Mm-hmm.
They're new members of the Big 12. Before that, they were in like Conference USA or something. I don't even remember what their conference was. Now, why did that happen? How is that happening? They literally went out and bought a starting lineup in volleyball last year. They got massive NIL money from their oil supporters, right? They're big oil people, and they got massive money for NIL, and they went out and got an all-star lineup out of the portal. Every one of their starters, or all but one, so let's say 5 of the 6 players on SMU's team were transfers.
Right.
Basically hired guns. And that allowed them to beat the 2 teams that most would argue, from beginning of season to end of season, were the 2 most consistent teams in volleyball last year, Pittsburgh and Nebraska. And both of them were defeated by SMU.
Right.
Okay. I know they had a great year in football, and they were either right on the edge or, in the hunt throughout the season, ranked and everything, kind of out of nowhere, a little bit like Indiana, right? So this whole portal thing changes the entire dynamic, and your traditional success does not predict future success in any sport if you aren't making good decisions with your NIL and your revenue share dollars. And so that's why so many schools are investing so many dollars in, general managers and other staff personnel, that their primary focus is going to be on NIL and understanding the marketplace and understanding talent evaluation as it relates to the portal as much as it relates to high school recruits, right?
Right.
Because we've had the best high school recruiting in volleyball, for example, for the better part of the last 6 or 7 years, year in and year out. I mean, Texas is right there with us, but we're probably a little above in terms of the level of talent that we've gotten coming out of high school. But because of all these changes and dynamics with NIL and with transfer portal players, other teams have been able to put together rosters that were every bit as good or even better than ours, because they were able to get players who were already proven performers at the Division I level, rather than waiting for the development process to take place in the traditional sense of freshmen building to sophomores, building to juniors, etc.
Right.
So it's a fascinating dynamic, and it's going to have a huge impact, I think, for Danny Busboom Kelly, our new coach, going forward.
Yes. And one quick correction, SMU is in the ACC. They lost the ACC championship game to Clemson, but they did make it into the playoff and lost to Penn State. So,
and I was wrong that they were in the Big 12. So, but you understand. You
Yes.
understand what my point is. I
Yes.
think it's a great example.
Yes. Now, talking about Danny Busboom Kelly, she was announced very shortly after John Cook announced his retirement. So we know that he came to the athletic director, said that he was looking to retire, and Troy Dannon made some reach outs, and I think Danny was right there at the top of the list. I know you mentioned before that she had a specific mention in her contract that basically she could leave if the Nebraska job became available, because Danny was a former player for Nebraska. She was on that 2006 national championship team, and then she worked under John Cook as an assistant coach from 2012 to 2016 before she then became the head coach at Louisville, and then has coached there since then, and of course went to the national championship finals just this past season.
Correct. And yes, so she was obviously going to get the first call, but because she had a very ongoing established relationship with John Cook, John was clearly her mentor. They talked regularly, and so they had known that, obviously John's 68 years old. He was near the end of his run, and I think what kind of kicked John off. It's kind of interesting. Probably a good time to mention it. We mentioned Ray Bouchard from Kansas, who also started his head coaching job at Kansas in 2000 along with John. So he and John came into the Big 12 together in 2000 as head coaches. And so their run went together. Well, Ray retired, and then that got John thinking, and ultimately led to John retiring. And then Mary Wise, who's also a legend, and maybe not on the Mount Rushmore because she never won a national title, but certainly just off the Mount Rushmore of coaches in women's volleyball. 43 years she coached with great success. I don't know how many SEC championships she won, but I think there might have been like a 10 or 12 year run in a row, right, where she won every year.
Right.
She had an incredible conference record in the SEC, went to the national semifinals, the Final Four, multiple times, and was also a successful coach, I think, at Iowa State before her time at Florida. So just a tremendous legend in the game, and we've lost 3 of them, this year alone, right? Like, so just a huge transition, if you will, within the sport. But how Danny Busboom Kelly transition to Nebraska happened, and what because Danny had made it clear to Louisville that she did have a desire, if the opportunity presented itself, for her own, what she wanted. Hey, I want to go back to Nebraska. They were ready. They knew that was a sport. That was the one job that if it ever came open and offered to her, she would probably go. So I think they had their ducks in a row. And so when Danny went into the athletic director at Louisville and said, it's time, the Louisville AD was fully prepared. And he went to Danny's assistant, who was also an assistant at Nebraska. Dan Meskey is his name, very good coach, and offered the job to Danny and Dan Meskey, and Dan said yes. And so, boom, both of those teams were able to sit in their room, be told that their coach was leaving, and within minutes, within an hour in each case, they were informed of who the new coach was going to be.
Right.
And as a result, I think in both cases, none of the players on either team left. Right? There was stability, there was confidence. The athletic departments had a plan. They also had a plan on how they were going to share that information with the rest of the world. It never leaked out by either one. In this day and age of agents and all that sort of stuff, the fact that didn't get out is pretty remarkable, right? So I think people are going to study that. Athletic directors are going to study that and say, how can we duplicate that set of circumstances? How can we be ready, at the ready, knowing, okay, if this happens, we're going to pull this trigger and we're going to do this. And the players are likely to be on board. Not that you can include them in this conversation, but you can anticipate a little bit and be prepared to at least try to have a smooth transition like Nebraska and Louisville did with their changes.
Right. And in terms of Danny Busboom Kelly, obviously her attachments to Nebraska and her past history with John, is already well established. But then as a head coach at Louisville, even though she's only been there for about 8 years, she's already won 4 conference titles, made 4 Final Fours, and been the runner-up twice in that time period, coming out of the ACC. She has a record of 203 wins and 44 losses, so about an 82% win rate. So obviously a bit below John's, but for a young coach and a female coach on top of that, obviously that's a very impressive start to her career. She literally is coming off of just being in the national championship, which she lost but played well in. So yeah, I mean, I don't think any Nebraska fans are gonna complain, right? Like it's a pretty ideal choice, right?
Right. Well, and she lost her best player in the middle of a semifinal game and lost her to injury, right? Anna DeBeer was her name, her best player, and they still won the game. Okay,
Right.
they still hung on and beat the preemptive number 1 Pitt to get them to the finals, and they competed against Penn State and gave them a heck of a run, even though they ultimately lost without their best player. That just screams to the level of commitment, effort, and team culture that she was able to create in her 8 years there. And that's why I'm very excited about what Danny can do at Nebraska. But she has challenges. She has challenges because it's hard when you come in and you're replacing a legend, right? Now, they were able to do it successfully between Terry Pettit and John Cook. It's not a guarantee, as we saw. Bob Devaney did a great job of transitioning between Bob and Tom Osborne, and it led to another 25 years of greatness for Tom Osborne. But then Tom tried to do something similar with Frank Solich, and it didn't lead to the same level of success.
Right.
So there's no guarantee.
In the big recent example, of course, for college football would be Nick Saban's retirement, and then the Washington coach replacing him and having a 9-3 regular season this past year, which obviously is still a good season overall, but for Alabama standards was disappointing.
I'm going to tell you that's a blip. I'm a big believer in that coach at Alabama. He was a guy that I had my eye on as a coach I wanted at Nebraska. He actually started his career right there in Nebraska. I think he coached at University of Nebraska Omaha or something like that. He had Nebraska connections, and he would have been an absolutely slam dunk hire for Nebraska. But he got hired by Washington the year before we chose to make a change with Scott Frost. So we just missed on the timing for him. So I'm convinced that transition will ultimately be good. And if you read anything about current recruiting, Alabama's rocking it in recruiting right now. So I think they're going to be just fine. The problem with Frank Solich was he didn't recruit. He was not able to sustain the level of talent flow that Tom Osborne had. And that was the biggest thing. When Frank had Tom's recruits, by and large, he did pretty well. In fact, I would argue that the Nebraska team of 1999 that Frank coached was the best team in the country. We lost one game to Texas, I believe, early in the year, and that kept us from playing for the national title. But other than that game, we certainly at the end of the year, strong argument could be made that we were playing the best football. Had there been a playoff back then, we might have very likely won the national championship that year.
Right.
So anyway, but as it relates to Danny and the volleyball subject that we're on, Danny's going to have some challenges. But this is where John, again, I think maybe unlike Tom, who retired in a year when there was massive departure of talent and experience from Nebraska's team between 95 and 96, John probably retired a year or two earlier than he needed to, and might very well have been able to accumulate a national championship or two in the next 2 years. We certainly are going to have one of the most talented rosters in the country for at least the next 2 years. So Danny at least has at her disposal a level of talent that should certainly put her in the conversation for national championship.
Yeah, kind of leaving the cupboards full, as it were.
Right, right. Which Terry Pettit did for John.
Right.
John inherited a team that had some remarkable talent on it.
Right. Obviously, and the fact that he won the national championship in his very first year, kind of
Right.
have to have that for that to happen.
And Danny, now she's been hired. I think she has a great focus on recruiting. She has already established a reputation as a great culture coach. The question is she going to be able to coach the X's and the O's? Is she going to be able to do the scouting and preparation? Something that John was always well known for. Plus, John's practice approach, very different than almost anybody else's. Again, that college football background, that skills-based stuff, right? And that's what led to us being the best defensive team in the country pretty much year in and year out. Will Danny Busboom continue to give that kind of commitment to defense that John did? I'm going to say not likely. There's going to be some tweaks. And does that mean we're going to drop off on our defensive capability? Quite possibly. But it also may mean that Danny does a way better job of preparing us offensively, opening things up, making us more creative, getting more aggressive, speeding up the tempo. There's a bunch of things that I think Danny may bring to the program that John didn't. And so, that might translate to better success, at least initially. And then we'll see if over time the defensive skills, atrophy because they're not spending the time on it that they did in the John Cook era.
Right.
So there's a lot to observe and be interested in. And again, during this time window, here we're a team where we picked up one player on the transfer portal simply because we have an athlete coming in at a position of need who had an ACL injury and is just recovering just recently, like literally a few weeks before she came to school at Nebraska. She got cleared to start playing again from her doctors, right? So she could probably benefit from maybe even a year as a redshirt to help rebuild her muscle and confidence and everything on her leg. And as a result, we got one transfer portal player to fill that spot, right? And we got somebody kind of late in the process who's very good, was a second team All Big 12 player, but she's not necessarily viewed as a difference maker, right? Where Wisconsin picked up 2 or 3 players that would be considered absolute difference makers. Texas picked up the best outside hitter available in the portal and the best libero available in the portal. And they already had one of the best liberos, and they already had a gluttony of talent on their outside hitter roster, including Whitney Lowenstein, who transferred from Nebraska a couple of years ago, who will be eligible this year. She was injured most of last season. So they're loaded. Kentucky also loaded, right, with some transfers. Penn State picked up some, but Wisconsin picked up 3. Arizona State, who won the Big 12 last year, did a phenomenal job in picking up the portal. And SMU, we talked about them just a few minutes ago. They also went back to the portal and just loaded up on portal talent.
Right. Well, and one last thought to kind of wrap up our conversation here is somewhat similar to Nick Saban in the football world, right? Obviously, John's been a longtime coach, kind of a more old school mentality, and he's talked about how he's adjusted to some realities of the new system, right, with the new transfer portal and social media, and all these things that the kids want to do nowadays, right? Like he's in their TikTok dances, and he's relaxed more now compared to where he was before and all that sort of stuff. But you got to believe that at least a part of the reason that he chose to retire now is because all these rapid changes that have happened in the past 5 years, he's had to adjust to them, and they're not necessarily his speed. They're not necessarily his style. So maybe getting a younger coach in who is more, used to that sort of world and more adaptable to, these more modern changes or whatever, maybe that is what Nebraska needs, to continue having success.
I totally agree. And I think she can shed maybe some traditions at Nebraska that might be holding them back a little bit too. John's emphasis on defense also played into our lack of statistical success on offense, right? I mean, when you're that focused on defense, it tends to mean you keep the ball up, but it also tends to mean that you're going to have a lot of situations where the ball is up, but out of system. So your attackers are not hitting perfect in-system sets, right? And which obviously hurts their attack percentages. So one leads to the other, right? And so what is it? The cart and horse. So there's just going to be a lot of things. The speed of our offense. John has been criticized for years for running too slow of an offense and not taking advantage of the athleticism that he had on his team. Maybe now Danny finds ways to do that.
Right.
We'll see. So there's some optimism for sure. And I think Danny was absolutely the right choice. I'm very excited to see what she can do with Nebraska's roster.
You hear that? That's the pessimism and good old Peter Schmitz over there. He said there's some optimism after we hire, the best coach available basically to fill John's shoes, and we have all this talent left in the cupboards, but he's still like, but there's still all these concerns. We might suck.
Well, you know what? And we're going to talk about this on a future podcast because I know this is getting long. And this is about the upcoming season. But John certainly didn't set up Danny for immediate success because her first 3 games are likely to all be against top 10 teams, maybe top 5.
Right.
So, I mean, they're going to be playing Kentucky down in Nashville, so closer to Kentucky than Nebraska. And that's probably going to have the best outside hitter duel in the country. I literally view both of their outside hitters as unstoppable. I don't know how we're going to be able to score enough points. As talented as we are, we don't have Lexi Rodriguez anymore. So our defense is likely to take a little bit of a step back. And we have some very good offensive talent, but we don't have the proven offensive talent that Kentucky has. They have Brooklyn DeLay and Eva Hudson. And Eva was the premier, one of the premier outside hitters in the Big Ten, all American, and DeLay was Player of the Year in the SEC, I think. So phenomenal, just absolutely incredible talent. So it's going to be a huge challenge for Danny to be able to, beat Pitt, who has the Player of the Year in their roster, and then beat Stanford, who's always great, and then beat Kentucky. Crazy start. Crazy.
All right. So yes, this has been a fun volleyball-focused podcast, and we dedicate this one to John Cook. Thank you for your 25 years with Nebraska, and we wish John and his family a pleasant retirement. Obviously, he'll still be around the program. I'm sure if Danny ever has a question, he'll be all ears to help her out and that kind of thing. But it's an exciting new era, right?
It is. It's an exciting new era. But boy, I sure enjoyed watching John's teams play. I'm a glutton for great defense. Love that in football. Love that in volleyball. And it was fun to watch our athletes. Some of them, like I've often said, women volleyball players are the best female athletes in the NCAA. Just absolutely spectacular athletes and a joy to watch.
Yes, definitely. All right. Well, if you all there enjoyed listening to this podcast, you can email us at huskerpete13@gmail.com. If anyone out there has any fun stories about John Cook or their interactions with the volleyball program over the past 25 years, feel free to reach out about that, or just leave us a question, a rating, a review. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We always love hearing feedback from the fans. So thank you out there for listening, and thank you, Dad, for joining me for this episode. And until next time, go Big Red.
Go Big Red.